So, what I'm going to be doing today is I want to create a tier list for Marvel Rivals. And part of this is just simply put is I am a math-driven individual who enjoys a lot of theory crafting, a lot of looking at the numbers, deriving information from numbers. So this tier list video is partly an experiment to kind of see how I use numbers to perceive information and kind of look at the numbers that exist and see, does that align or differ from community perception. And I'm going to be using this a lot today, this conversation, to kind of maybe create an opportunity to explore how data and community perception don't always align. And I think it's super, super interesting how that is, why that is, and kind of my own viewpoint on it. Now, I will go ahead and say right out the gate that I am not the best Marvel Rivals player by any stretch of the imagination. But I don't think necessarily that skill and the ability to read information are always necessary to be form good analysis. I think it's a good starting point, but not necessary. I am just a Grandmaster Rocket Raccoon main, so there is going to be some bias in that regard. So, hopefully, for those who are watching currently or are going to be watching at a later time, hopefully ends up being informative and ends up, maybe we learned something today. So, let's begin. So, what I'm going to do, just for my own sanity, is I'm going to be kind of going in order. And first off, I am just using Rivals Meta, using some of their information, and using some of the information on the site to kind of identify certain things. Now, some might be asking, like, well, why not just use their tier list if you're just going to derive the same information? Mostly because there is problems with how the tier list is formed, and I think it's a good starting point to understand why does this tier list exist? What is it telling us, and what could we be looking at to improve on? But before we do that as well, I'm going to be going kind of in order, talking about different ranks, and let's begin. So I'm going to actually start with the tanks, because the tanks are very interesting. If you were to just straight look at the data, one of the most interesting things I think that came out from the season is all the tanks were fairly strong. On average, if you were playing a tank, you were probably able to climb ladder, which is actually really interesting, and it kind of makes sense considering there is such a lack of tank players in the game. So one of the things that you'll notice is across all ranks, most of the tanks, even the worst at Venom, is 48.73, and it is worth noting that Venom was buffed, if memory serves me correctly, around 1.5. So not quite at the beginning. Thing obviously didn't exist, and we'll talk about that as well. But even the worst performing tank at all ranks is still fairly close to 50-50, which is actually not a bad statistic to have in your game. You're always going to have some variance, but the closer you are to 50% generally means the game is more balanced. So, again, looking at, as we go across the ranks, we tend to see that as we continue to climb up, obviously different characters will change their ranks, and we are going to use some of that as a foundation for some of the conversations that I have. And I think Captain America is a great one to kind of showcase this point. So Captain America ends up being strong. Now, with this being said, Captain America, if you were to look at him, 51% win rate in gold, so meaning that the lowest tier player, even if you were unskilled, had a decent chance of winning. And again, there's probably some numbers. We'll have to discuss that as well. Reasonable pick rate, 11%. Nothing crazy. We get to gold, it does dip a little bit. The number of picks for Captain America do drop. But then as we begin to climb up higher in the ladder, his win rate once again begins to pick up to about 53% win rate in Diamond Plus, 53.6 in Grandmaster Plus, and obviously above that, it continues to stay high. It is worth knowing that Captain America has a lower pick rate, which generally means that less people are picking him in comparison to tanks. Obviously, Strange and Magneto just being some of the most picked tanks in the game. So, what this ends up meaning is Captain America is good, but there's also a little bit of an issue in that mostly the higher you went up into the ranking system, Captain America mains are going to play Captain America. Your average guy who's told to solo fill or who's going to play tank for the good of the team is not picking Captain America. So this does skew the win rate because only people who are playing Captain America and are skilled at Captain America are likely winning on the character. But the fact that he has such a high win rate as you go higher and higher does tend to mean that he had a very strong kit. If you ever did play against Captain America, you know the feeling of having that super sticky, highly mobile, almost unkillable tank just disrupting your backlines. And it's super frustrating to play against. And eventually what this means is ultimately, at the end of the day, any adjustments to Captain America are going to be felt. The only thing I think that's keeping Captain America back from being one of the higher tier picks is, again, just a lower pick rate overall means how is he really accessible to the average player? And I think that's a really fair question. Obviously, once you hit gold, meaning that your kind of base level skills should be forming, and that he's still only 50% win rate. In fact, his win rate is worse in the early stages. Generally means that he probably has a slightly higher skill ceiling compared to other characters. I think that's just due to button bloat from my personal perspective. But again, people who play tanks are going to have a better opinion on that, have a better perspective of that. But I think that he's ultimately very, very, very strong. Now, to kind of save a little bit of time on this, I'm going to go ahead, make this, and kind of speed up the Vanguards a little bit. And I'm going to explain why. Because one of the things that ended up being the case with tanks this season is, as I've already mentioned, most of your tanks all kind of end up being in the same spot. There isn't a massive difference between the power level of tanks overall. The only thing that really ends up being the case is ultimately where are they at in the big picture. And I don't think that using Captain America as a base kind of helps us to form an understanding of why, how we can see data and kind of act as a beginning point to understanding, okay, well, win rate isn't everything, right? Just because there's a higher win rate doesn't necessarily mean that they deserve a higher placement. There is some wiggle room. But I'm ultimately going to put Thor as the best tank in the game by a mile. This is because Thor overall had a very decent pick rate across all tiers and has a considerably high top 3 win rate across all tiers. The other thing that's really fascinating is Thor kind of consistently sits at 52% win rate virtually in every single tier. It is just like this magical sweet spot for Thor, just roughly that 52%, and his pick rate doesn't really change drastically. It's got a roughly somewhere between 15 to 20% pick rate. So this ends up being the A character that is widely picked, high presence, consistent win rate, whether you are in the lowest tier or the highest tier, which means that not only is his kit really strong for the average player, and is something quick that the average player can pick up, but as you continue to get higher tier, there is enough flexibility in his kit and enough variety of action, enough options in his kit to help you still carry that game. His kit is neither too simple nor too complex, and it only shows that that consistent win rate allows for the flexibility of good players to continue maintaining a high level of skill. And with him being a consistent top three win rate tank at all levels, Thor, I think, was just absolutely the strongest thing you could have been playing. There was no reason not to be picking Thor. Moving on, then we get to the rest of the tanks. And I'm going to kind of speed run some of this, but not too much. First off, let's start with the Thing. I think Thing, ultimately, as a new addition, was a fantastic addition to the game. Ended up being incredibly strong. Someone that is able to do a lot of damage, also have a lot of survivability. Also, just whether you were a good player or a bad player, you probably were consistently 50-50. This just means that the Thing's damage was just super high, and the utility, I think, was a much needed addition to the game. Him not being as disruptable by CC was super impressive, being kind of a counter to Wolverine. The ability to bust through other frontline tanks was also incredibly amazing. Having the ability to dive and having very powerful CC ult ends up just making the Thing really, really a great addition to the game. I'm actually kind of surprised. I was immediately a little worried if Thing would just end up being a boring bottom tier tank, and turns out he's a lot of fun, straightforward. The skill range difference is kind of like Thor, isn't so extreme that like the win rate difference between the lowest tier and the highest tier isn't all that much different. So if you're a new player, you can easily pick up the Thing. Obviously, there's some flexibility that as you get better, you'll continue to do, better as the Thing, but it's not so egregious that it's just unplayable. Groot, I think, as the season progressed, more and more people began to recognize how annoying Groot is. Groot Walls is a masterful pain in the rear. It is super frustrating. It is super hard to play against. But I think ultimately the problem with Groot is Groot got better the better the players are. And as you can see, if you start at bronze, Groot is sub 50. Get to gold, lowest win rate out of all the tanks. Now, granted, he's still 48.5, so it's not like he's terrible. But as you begin to climb, his win rate continues to go up and up and up. And the problem is, I think, ultimately with Groot, is Groot just has a high skill ceiling. The Groot skill ceiling in comparison to other tanks is much, much higher, making him incredibly strong, but really only gets to show the full power of the champion the higher the skill levels of the players. And I think that if Groot does end up getting now I think thankfully we already know the patch that's going out, he's not getting supposedly any changes for next season, which is decent. It's a good thing. Because I think where he's at right now is a good spot. Maybe in the future they may have to tweak that, depending on the power level of other characters. But right now he's just a masterful combination of CC, utility, damage. But I think that the skill level prevents him from being the best thing in the game. Then we get to Strange and Magneto. And this is where I'm going to have to, again, use numbers to provide an interesting conversation piece. If you were to just look at raw win rate for both of these characters, and I'm kind of putting them in the same category because of this, you would notice that they are generally on the semi-lower end. And as you can see, as you hit Diamond Plus, they're both bottom. Now, granted, 49, 48, not a terrible place. But the problem with Strange and Magneto is they do have the lowest win rates in the game for tanks, but I don't think that's reflective of the power level of tanks. The problem with Strange and Magneto is the following. They are both the highest pick rate tanks, especially in higher tiers. So if we actually sort by pick rate, you see 31% and 25% for Doctor Strange and Magneto. So, okay. So are they weak? Are they strong? What's going on? What's happening is anyone who has played ranked Marvel Rivals understand that there is a general lack of tank players in the game. This means that bad players are going to play Doctor Strange and Magneto. You're going to have people who are healer mains, DPS mains, who have never played, like, maybe played a handful of tank games in ranked, picking one of these two tanks because the community perception is these are powerful tanks. And that's totally fair. They have good, solid kits. Their kits aren't overly complicated. I would argue Strange is probably a little bit worse than Magneto because I think there is a little bit more complexity in this kit. But I also think that's why Magneto gets picked way more. Is Magneto not just is a good tank, so good tank players are going to play him, but a lot of low skill, non traditional tank players are playing Magneto, dropping his win rate in a significant way. So, ultimately, I think this is where we have to kind of look at the numbers and make a meaningful understanding of okay, so they have the lowest win rate. That doesn't necessarily mean they're the worst characters in the game. It just means that they, unfortunately, we need more data. Are tank mains playing Magneto? Are tank mains playing Doctor Strange? What's the percentage of that? Unfortunately, the website here that is a good foundation. I think it's an interesting like starting point. Doesn't give us that information. There's no way I can understand the win delta and understand, how frequently is it being picked only by tank mains. But the reality is that these two are incredibly strong, but are probably getting bloated stats from non-tank players who are forced to play tank and ranked. So that is something to keep in mind. This is one of the reasons I keep them as strong, even though their win rates are arguably comparatively lower than the rest of the tanks in the meta. Finally, we get to the bottom three. And I think that ultimately they all kind of have kind of weirdly similar problem. And I could actually make an argument to actually maybe put Penny much higher up. And actually, I probably should. Let me think about this one more time. There might be an argument to put Penny above, slightly above, but I'm going to keep her there for now, and I'll explain why. No, actually, I will change my mind on that. I do think she's probably the next strongest. So, with Penny, I think my initial impression of Penny is someone that, or no, actually, even the pick rate actually justifies that. No, I was totally right on this. Yeah, I was confused by the data. Okay. If there was a tier in between these two, I would probably put her there. So, with Penny, Penny is a character that I think is probably the biggest argument that could probably be between either one, and it's probably a good argument, and you can make a good case either for. Penny has a decently high win rate. I think comparatively to other tanks, though, her win rate is much lower. Generally, people who are playing Penny are going to be, especially in the highest tiers of play, are going to be people who mostly play Penny. If you look, Penny's second most picked at Diamond Plus. Get to Grandmaster, the least picked character in the game. And as we continue to go throughout all the tiers, she's not really that highly picked, but she performs incredibly well. And I think this is just an ultimate sign that, like, generally, Penny players are playing Penny. People who play a lot of tank, people who enjoy that role, are going to be playing Penny. And so I think that where she's currently in a good spot. And I think that you could, again, make the case that she could be in the strong category. I think that right now, the win rate stat is going to be a little bloated because, again, if you're a Penny main, you should on average have higher win rates. That should be the case. That is completely normal. But is she as accessible overall? Does that mean that her base kit is good enough that the average player could pick her up and play her? And that I don't know. I think currently, right now, the stats kind of show that it's mostly just Penny mains that are mostly playing her. And so I'm going to go on the side that she's probably just a little bit underpowered. That now, granted, there was also a bug fix that happened, I think, what was it, last week or the week before? And she will be getting upcoming buffs in the next season, and those are going to be worth talking about when we get to there. And that could definitely change whether she's just, hey, a good character that probably needs more attention, or is she really that strong? And finally, we get to Hulk and Venom that are both kind of in the same spot. Venom did get a nice buff this season. Hulk was nerfed going from season 0 to season 1. Ultimately, I think the problem with both of these characters in the beginning of season 1 was that they were both highly mobile, but they just don't have the durability of other tanks. And when we take a look throughout, we kind of see that they're kind of fulfilling similar roles. The Hulk actually gets a little bit better as you go up. Venom kind of stays on the lower end throughout most of the season, though granted he didn't get buffed till later in the season, and Hulk kind of just sits middle of the pack. I think Hulk is incredibly good, and Venom was incredibly good, and I think that picking these champions probably still improved your win rate over playing anything else. Like, if your team didn't have a tank, picking a tank improved your odds of winning. But I think the reality is with both of these is that, unfortunately, compared to the other tanks in the meta, their mobility is not giving them enough leverage in the game to really pop off. They do okay damage, they're a little bit sticky, but just don't have the survivability to survive in this meta, or are not able to get those immediate, like, secure kills on the backline divers for them to really be the most powerful tanks in the game. So overall, if you were picking any tank in the meta right now, you were doing your team a favor. I think that's ultimately the lesson to learn from this, is just ultimately people should have been playing tanks. The fact that they weren't was handicapping their team, but that's okay. Now we get to a little bit more of my area of expertise, which is the strategist role. I'm going to leave the DPS for last because there is a lot of DPS. There is a lot more to say. And actually, no, we'll save my expertise for last. We'll go DPS last. But I am going to do something to kind of help myself out a little bit. I'm going to treat ranged DPS as two separate categories, even though I know this game is a little bit more complex than that. The other thing I'm going to say as well, and the reason I'm doing that is because I want to have one tank, one melee, one ranged DPS, and one strategist in the final conversation. And so let us begin. Black Panther. If you have not had the fun and enjoyment of facing Black Panther in ranked, you were lucky, because that champion is annoying. Now, there is some bias, there is some things to say here. Black Panther is bad in lower ranks, or actually bad in bronze when no one has the skills to actually play. The moment you hit silver and gold, look at that win rate shoot up. But then as you start to reach higher and higher ranks, Black Panther begins to kind of fall off a little bit. And I think there's a reason for this, and this is why I would say he's strong overall. The problem with divers in general is high skilled players really can take advantage of a champion like Black Panther and the other divers that we're going to eventually talk about, like Magic, like Psylocke, etc. But divers, I think, ultimately suffered this season because healing CDs became such a massive talking point from season 0 into season 1 and were a major kind of focus of the season 1 meta, even into 1.5. Healing CDs were good. And even though they did make nerfs to healing CDs, some of that residual meta, especially in the first half of season 1, ends up being a major talking point. Now, as we get into 1.5, and I think some of that triple healing meta begins to die down a little bit, it's still played. Like, it's not like the healing meta just, the triple heals stop being played. You can even see all ranks about, not quite 20%, but definitely closer to 18% of all games had triple heal comps. That is a significant portion of games. So almost 1 in 5 games have triple heals. So that meta never really died. And unfortunately, I think triple heals does make it harder for some of these divers to really capitalize. So ultimately, at the end of the day, the divers, the skilled players can really do disgusting things with the divers, but I think ultimately just we're not good enough to really pop off. And I think that unfortunately Black Panther was not the best diver you could be playing, but definitely someone super powerful. Unfortunately, Black Widow's dumpster fire. Just you pack it up, call it a day. If she's your favorite, I'm sure you can get wins on the champion. But the reality is, when your average across the board is a 41% win rate at all ranks, that's not a good sign. And considering that she has one of the worst pick rates in the game as well, this generally means the only people who are going to pick her are bad players. Good players do not play bad characters. Now, community perception, as I said in the beginning of this video, can influence some of these stats. So if the community perceives that Black Widow is trash, good players won't play her. But ultimately, if you're at a 41% win rate with one of the lowest pick rates in the game, there are always going to be Black Widow mains. There are always going to be somebody out there who mains this character. And this just means that the ratio of people playing Black Widow to the casual player is going to be much more skewed to people who are consistently playing her. And unfortunately, that win difference is too extreme. 41%. So basically, you're putting a 9%. If you know, and I'm being over, like, I'm over exaggerating, but you're pretty much already putting a 9%, or I guess you could even say like an 18% difference, if you want to put it that way, that the enemy team wins because you picked Black Widow. Because you're choosing someone who is just so blatantly underpowered that you're just giving the enemy team that advantage. So what they could do with that, I don't know. Now, granted, she's supposed to be getting potentially a rework later in season 2. So hopefully that will fix her problem. I'm no expert on DPS players. I can't tell you what would really solve her problem. My initial instinct says you need to buff her base damage on her primary weapon. But again, I'm going to leave that decision to people who play the character more or play DPS in the role to really make that decision. My job is just to look at the numbers and say, this character doesn't work. Something is fundamentally flawed. Next up, Hawkeye. Now, Hawkeye can be frustrating. And Hawkeye is one of those characters that has extremely high highs and extremely low lows. So, again, he kind of is going to fall into a similar problem as we've already seen before. You come down here, and in the lowest level of play, barely pushing 44% win rate. And we can notice Black Widow is like even worse than that. But as you kind of slowly climb up a little bit, Hawkeye also begins to climb. 51% win rate on Hawkeye. Okay. But then he kind of drops again once you start to get higher and higher up again. So what's happening? Here's this weird deal where he starts low, climbs up, then goes back low again. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, Hawkeye is a high skill character. He is a high skill character, but the payouts don't exist to a high enough degree. And ironically, the next character we're going to talk about is going to kind of highlight this point. Hawkeye can do crazy things. The fact that he is one of the few snipers in the game that can truly one-shot somebody out from just out of existence is insane. But unfortunately, if you can't do that consistently, or you don't have the tools in place to make that a consistent reality, unfortunately, you're going to seem underpowered. And right now, some of the things that are happening in the game is he can still do a ton of damage, but not every shot's a one shot. So if he hits somebody, a healer's just going to heal it up, and then he's got to go back and try to get the next headshot. And if he's not consistently landing those, unfortunately, over time, that's going to matter. And I think that's why we're seeing that kind of weird win rate spike in mid-tier, where his win rate goes up because the skill level of Hawkeye begins to matter. And I actually think that what happens is, offensively, skilled players excel more offensively in like middle tier, so like gold, plat, diamond. But then once you get up to even higher levels, then people's defensive skill sets start to kick in. And that's when the power level of these characters like Black Panther, Hawkeye, Psylocke, etc. begin to dwindle a little bit, because they're prepared to play against those high skilled offensive players. The quality of the skill ceiling of these players is not high enough to surpass the understanding of higher skilled players, that they go, oh, I'm facing against a Hawkeye, I need to be more wary of headshots. I'm going to position around that. Hela. Honestly, I'm going to be honest. I really thought about putting Hela as like, I think if the numbers read a little bit differently, Hela would be an amazing case argument for one of the strongest range characters in the game. But the numbers don't quite reflect that, which I think is really interesting. Because anytime I see a Hela in my game, she is doing crazy amounts of work. But I don't think that right now, even though she is incredibly strong, I'm sure many players have had a suffocating game where Hela is just an absolute monster and is solo carrying the game, and her ability to pick players is super good. I think ultimately at the end of the day, it's a similar issue to what is going on with Hawkeye. The skill ceiling is still there. You still need to hit the hit scan headshots, which is much easier than hitting a projectile headshot by any means. And the reality is that Hela's primary weapon fire rate is so fast that she can easily land back-to-back headshots before someone is registering what is happening. So that, combined with her mobility, combined with her CC, just gives her such an insane kit that on paper, if I wasn't looking at the win rates and looking at the numbers, I would honestly be putting her much higher and would argue that she is easily one of the best characters in the game. Unfortunately, I think that the reality just says that right now, even though she does have a crazy kit, even though I think that if you wanted to play Hela at any tier of play, you are more than justified in playing Hela. And especially like as you get into these middle tiers, Hela is going to seem very good. But I think at the highest levels of play, she's strong, but I think there are slightly better picks. It's just ultimately, it just comes down to, she is strong, she's borderline OP, but I don't think she is the absolute best thing you can be playing, at least in the context of solo queue. Human Torch. I can't believe I'm actually saying this, but I actually do not believe Human Torch is dumpster fire as much as I thought. And that's absolutely blowing my mind that the numbers kind of read that way. I was certain Human Torch would be absolute trash. And he's not. But I'm going to still let my biases play. So, I genuinely thought on release, and I still believe this now, the Human Torch is underpowered. And that's just a fact of when you look at him, when you look at his win rate, when you look at the way that he plays, especially in like your quick play games where just you have bad players or just a mixture of players in the lobby, Human Torch just does all this damage, but doesn't really secure kills very well. And that is a terrible thing for a damage focused character to be doing. If he is not securing kills, that is not healthy. Now, I will say, again, and this is kind of the argument that I'm going to make into why I don't think he gets to be put in the strong category despite his crazy high win rates and higher tiers, is look at the pick rate of this character. 3.62. This means that the people who are playing Human Torch now are the ones who actually play Human Torch and like Human Torch. I think at that pick rate, what does that put him? Right next to people like Mr. Fantastic. I'm actually surprised Iron Man that low, and Black Widow. Human Torch is not picked by a large quantity of players. The players who are picking him have figured him out. They understand the character. They are succeeding with the character. They know what makes the character strong and are comfortable playing it. And I think that ultimately that means that right now, until there's a fundamental change in his kit, I think ultimately means that he's going to continue being harder for players to figure out. Now, the reality is that with the win rate that high, that means that his high end is there. People just need to figure that out. And ultimately, the question is, what is it that good Human Torches are doing that is allowing them to win? And until that gets figured out and that becomes a broader accepted strategy by the higher tier players, I think he will appear underpowered while performing particularly well. Oh, Chi Kwon Chung Hong. Chi Kwon Chung Hong. So, Iron Fist ends up being underpowered. Again, I'm not going to keep deep diving into all the numbers. We are going to speed things up just a little bit. Just again, follows a similar pattern as some of the other divers, but I think ultimately where his issue kind of becomes is his damage burst is not as high as Psylocke's, Black Panther's, Magic's burst. And I think, unfortunately, his limited damage output capacity right now is problematic. And Iron Fist is kind of has a confusing identity as being somewhere between, he's not quite a burst dive DPS, but he's also not quite an off tank either. He's kind of got a confused identity, and it's really, I think, hurting his overall space in the game. Iron Man. Oh, Iron Man. Iron Man, Iron Man, Iron Man. Iron Man, at the beginning of this season, or when we were coming out of Season 0, was incredibly powerful, especially with his team up with the Hulk. The changes that they made to him seemed to be good, but not really enough to elevate him to a crazy high level. And consistently we see that Iron Man's kind of just sitting middle of the pack, but we don't know if that's necessarily whether because that's his gamma or whether that's just his baseline. And that is something to discuss. There is a significant power difference between his top end and his a significant difference between his top end and what he's doing with Gamma. When he has Gamma, he is a clearly overpowered character. Without it, he's just someone that is good. And I think ultimately this is why we have to kind of discuss or put that, like, Iron Man is in a decent spot. He's just not ultimately the best thing in the game, not clearly the strongest. the second best character, or one of the next character to get put in the best category. And this is going to be for our melee DPS. Magic is crazy. Consistently high win rate across all categories with an incredibly high pick rate. 13.71 pick rate. That is actually kind of nuts. So you consider that she is the most picked melee in all ranks and is crushing it. So as we continue on, now again, we notice down here 55% win rate, but the pick rate does go down. So let me flip this around. But no matter what tier you're in, she's consistently high win rate with a reasonable pick rate. Above 10% pick rate, so basically 1 in every 10 players is considering this character. And they're winning. Oh wow, Iron Fist actually does better the better he goes. So, but there is a massive delta as you continue to go. Well, actually, he stays tired. Maybe I'm. No, there he goes. Wait, actually, where'd he go? He go way down. No matter what tier you're in, Magic is a threat. She is a consistent threat at every tier. She has a strong win rate. She has a reasonably high pick rate. If you had the time and energy to invest in Magic, Magic was easily the best melee DPS you could be playing. If you want to learn melee, right now, Magic seems to be accessible enough to players that, with some time and energy, you can learn the character, but also has a height of skill ceiling that skill level continues to carry into higher tiers, where I think Black Panther kind of falls off. What I think makes her better is that she is not just a burst DPS like Black Panther is. Black Panther is a burst. Magic has burst, but she's not just burst. She is someone who is doing a combination of disruption, CC, burst, damage, while when she also uses her ult, it's kind of like this weird, like, DPS pseudo tank. So ultimately, she becomes an even bigger monster that can easily bait out healer ults. And if she's baiting out healer ults, that's ultimately good for your team because she doesn't care whether your healer, the enemy healers have ult or not. She's going to kill them either in their ult or outside of their ult. That is a crazy value to have. Absolutely crazy. Alrighty. Next one on the list, and this is where I think, again, I'm going to probably get some criticisms on, but I think I'm fine with this as a discussion. Mr. Fantastic. Now, Mr. Fantastic, I think, is a little weird because this is one of the things I'm going to get into a lot more with the healers, but I think Mr. Fantastic is one of the few major DPS that has to kind of get looked at with a special lens. So I think most people kind of understand that when you pick Mr. Fantastic, that's not really a DPS in the truest sense. The categories that we make, the Vanguard, the Duelist, the Strategist, is a little deceptive. It leads to a cognitive bias from the community about what these characters are doing. And I think most people by now kind of recognize that Mr. Fantastic says Duelist because of the way that his stats are, that like his beginning stats are, but really he's really playing the role of an off tank, and that he succeeds very well when you kind of view him as an off tank. And I think that ultimately this is where we kind of have to look at his stats with a bit of an eye because one, he does have very decent win rates, but he has an incredibly poor pick rate as well. And he has one of the worst pick rates amongst DPS characters, despite actually performing incredibly well at all ranks. But again, that goes back to the point of, as I mentioned during the tank section, that tank players or tanks were incredibly valuable. If you were playing a tank, you were contributing significantly to the successes of your team. Mr. Fantastic is basically a way for you to say, I'm playing DPS, but I'm providing a tank utility. And I think that ultimately this means that Mr. Fantastic is ultimately viable and incredibly strong, but it's hard to really gauge the overall value of this character because the people who are playing Mr. Fantastic are going to be the Mr. Fantastic mains. I think with the upcoming buffs, he's likely going to see a lot more play. We'll see. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. But ultimately, I think Mr. Fantastic was a viable pick throughout this season. I think he was incredibly good. I think it was a really easy way for people to say, or there was an opportunity for a lot of people to say, I just want to play DPS, but I don't, or my team needs a tank, but I don't really want to play tank. I'm going to play Mr. Fantastic, and now my team kind of has a tank, and no one's yelling at me. But I'm going to go do DPS things. Super great. Moon Knight. Oh, if my friend was here, he would be somewhat upset, but that's okay. Moon Knight, Moon Knight, Moon Knight. So, Moon Knight, probably realistically, is probably the closest you can get to dumpster fire without me putting him in dumpster fire. And ultimately, the problem is that he just doesn't do anything at any tier. He is a low performer. He has okay pick rate, but the reality is that his win rate doesn't realistically change no matter what tier you're looking at. He is consistently a 44% win rate character and actually does worse than even Black Widow in Celestial Plus. Moon Knight is terrible right now. Ultimately, I think the only thing that, if I was going to make the case for Moon Knight, is that Moon Knight has the opportunity to synergize with other characters at this point in time. And people did begin to see those characters, but his nerfs leading into season one were so egregious, and the nerf to his ult was so egregious that he just cannot find a place in the meta right now. And I think that ultimately we see a potential for Moon Knight, and I think there are definitely games that show, and I think if we looked at the data and looked at like when Moon Knight is paired with Groot, when the opportunity for Moon Knight to really shine, kind of a pseudo synergy. But outside of his pseudo synergies, Moon Knight is not very good. All right. Namor. Is this going to be my first real, like, kind of controversial one? I think it is now. It's time for my controversial pick. Yep. It's time. So, a lot of people, and if you were to look at Namor's kit on paper, people would say that Namor is incredibly strong. And in fact, I think the overall community perception of Namor suggests that he is incredibly strong. The reality is, I think that he is incredibly overhyped. And I will kind of explain why this discrepancy exists and like what the issue is. So, when you play Namor, Namor has a bit of a skill-based kit, but the reality is, unlike divers like Black Panther, Psylocke, Magic, that skill expression doesn't come through in win rate. The other major problem with Namor is this misconception of what his role is in the game. And I'll explain what I mean. Now, in order for us to get a really better understanding of where Namor excels versus where he does not excel, we would need more game data. But I'm going to take this time to kind of extrapolate some guesses based on the fact that if you look, bronze tier, decently picked, gold tier, decently picked, diamond tier, second most picked, and as you continue climbing up, Namor gets picked a frequent amount. So why is this? Why are we picking someone who isn't doing very well? One, community perception. Two, I think the other reason is people are picking Namor without understanding what his role is. And the first thing is the sort of anti-Spider-Man, anti-Venom, aka Namor the ultimate answer to anti-dive. I think that this misconception leads to egregious losses in win rate. Because I think that people who do not play Namor pick Namor in response to seeing champions like Black Panther, Spider-Man, Venom, maybe even Hulk, etc. And when they do so, they do not fulfill that role of anti-dive. Namor has a decent amount of utility and can somewhat play as an anti-dive character, but ultimately is not an exceptional anti-dive champion himself. AKA, to put it another way, he is not a give me 1 second, sorry about that. He is not a hard counter to dive. One could argue that he is a soft counter, as in, yes, your win rate may go up if you play Namor against these characters, but you're not guaranteed a victory in any capacity. That misunderstanding, I think, is ultimately what drives Namor down. And I think that until that community perception is corrected, we're going to see situations where Namor's win rate is incredibly hard. But I have to keep him underpowered, or I have to kind of explain that he's underpowered because he's not fulfilling the role that people think he should be fulfilling. And that as a response, people are losing games because they have this vision of what he should be doing, and he's not fulfilling that vision. And it's ultimately a question of, is he really a bad character? No. But is he this incredible one-all? No. I think in terms of sniping potential, you still would rather play Hela. I think in terms of kind of survivability, he does have survivability. He does have damage. He is incredibly annoying to play with. He has a good ult. But at the end of the day, he is not as strong as people imagine him to be, and he is not this ultimate, like, hard counter to dives that people wish that he was. Let's see. Thank you. So, moving along. Psylocke. We gotta take a re-look at Psylocke real quick. So, Psylocke is in a bit of an interesting place. Because Psylocke is, again, one of those champions that is a little bit hard to judge at face value. Because she is kind of in that diver territory. But I think a lot of people have a much better perception of Psylocke than what the results actually say, which makes it difficult for me to provide the analysis, because I'm providing an analysis that I'm looking at the numbers, and the numbers tell me one thing, and I'm trying to determine whether I'm happy going against certain community perceptions. So here's where I'm going to place her. So Psylocke is, again, fits that diver role, fits that sort of Black Panther. I think ultimately, though, her skill expression is much, much higher than Black Panther. Her combo potentials aren't as strong. And I think that right now, with the current meta of healing supports in the game, Psylocke isn't able to steamroll a game by herself in the way that maybe other DPS can. Now, this may seem very, very, very strange, because I'm sure we've all been in a game where that one Psylocke with like 30 final hits dunked on your lobby, and you just felt like crap. I think the reality is that Psylocke as a character is going to have extreme highs and extreme lows, as divers are tend to do, but ultimately her highs don't come as frequently as other characters. And if she's not getting those crucial picks, where Black Panther's picks are a little bit more immediate, Psylocke's has to be a little bit more prepared, a little bit more smarter about it. And if she's diving the backline and not actually getting those kills that are crucial to her success, you're just wasting time. I think that ultimately she is in a good spot, and I think that she fulfills a role. And I'm not even sure I would encourage buffing her right now, considering that she has a decent play rate. But I also don't think that she is, with the current state of the meta, as strong as perception would tend to lead you to believe. Which I think is really strange to say, but I think it is ultimately the reality. Scarlet Witch, I shouldn't have to explain it. Low win rate. I think she's not terrible. I think ultimately the problem is again, she's okay, but I don't think that in the end all be all, she's not like making a scene in any particular tier. She does get picked because she's easy to play. She has an okay kit. I think she just doesn't have a kit that allows her to excel and to put the game on her back, especially at higher levels. So I think she's just right now underpowered. I think she's probably in a good spot in terms of just what the future looks like is going to hold for her, but she just needs those little buffs. She's not garbage. Like, I think some people would like almost imagine her as being kind of dumpster fire, but I think that she's in a okay spot. Just it needs to be buffed. She's just not consistently strong enough. Oh boy, Spider Man, Spider Man, Spider Man, Spider Man. So anyone who has been playing ranked consistently this season knows how egregious Spider-Man can be. And it's also worth noting the ban rate of Spider-Man. Spider-Man is a menace. Spider-Man being able to just dive, half CC, do all the things perfectly matches what the data shows. In low tier, you look at the win rate, Spider-Man isn't very good because, again, bad players don't have the skill level. But as they start to develop the skill, which usually starts about gold, at gold you begin to have the minimum skill level to put games on your back. And that makes Spider-Man a menace. And this is why when we look at win rate statistics, his win rate goes up significantly as you are in higher games. But once you start hitting those diamond, those grandmasters, first problem is you're gonna get banned out. And I think that ultimately, I think that's kind of a sad reality for Spider-Man is you're not getting through the ban list. The community perception of what he does is too good. And then when he is finally getting through the ban list, he still has a decent pick rate. But a lot of players, from having been playing against Spider-Man so often, are better prepared for how do we play against Spider-Man? What should we be doing against Spider-Man? What is my personal play? And so ultimately, I think that if you were going to rate Spider-Man, he is definitely one of the better, really strong DPS for Melee. I think he's just shy of being the best, where I think Magic is more consistent in that department. Star-Lord. Star-Lord's just good. He is consistently good. He is someone that, is at all ranks, like, not quite the best thing you could be playing, but also is not even the work, like, is someone that is going to consistently be roughly 50%, which in the grand scheme of ranking, if you have above 50% win rate consistently at almost every tier, yes, Thor's S, correct. That's a major thing. Now, it is worth noting, and I would make this argument in the case of Star-Lord. Star-Lord was also paired with arguably the best team-up in the game. And I haven't talked about team-ups throughout most of this video, because I think there is an argument to be made that, like, some team-ups do make an actual difference. Thor also being another character who has incredibly powerful team-ups. But I think that ultimately we would need to know how often those team-ups were picked. All we know right now is that the team-up for Star-Lord was one of the best ones in the game, which probably does skew the numbers, but the question is how much, considering that Adam Warlock was not really a high pick rate until much later into the season. Then that would be an argument to say, okay, maybe there's something to the argument that, like, was Star-Lord actually stronger, or was he carried by an overpowered team up? Same thing with Thor. You could kind of make the argument, but I also think that feeding into the argument, the consistency of you getting those team ups with Thor means you should be playing Thor. So, continuing along. Now the best ranged DPS in the game. Storm was just a monster. She started off season 0 an absolute beast. The changes that they made kind of took some of her individual power level away from her, but ultimately gave the team utility a buff. And I think this is something that's hard for people to appreciate. And I think does a good job in reflecting in the stats of Storm. Her pick rate did go down. So you could argue, well, maybe it was just Storm players who were playing Storm. There's a little bit of an argument for that. But I think there's also a second argument that we don't value utility as individual players. As part of our community perception, we don't fully appreciate when someone provides utility to the team that isn't easily visual to see. So, for example, when Groot ults somebody and he locks 4 people in place, we see that utility. We appreciate that utility. When Storm provides an AoE damage thrower to the team, no one really, like, you might appreciate rare moments of it, but honestly, you're probably not really understanding how much value that's getting in the course of an entire game. And that is a real interesting consequence of kind of community perception and how some characters don't get valued as highly, even though, if we look, Storm was a consistently high win rate, slightly underpicked, I will make that argument, but was consistently high win rate in virtually every tier, minus a couple. Now, granted, again, not the highest pick rate. There are definitely characters with a much higher pick rate, but ultimately, she was picked a fair amount, and I think that ultimately the lack of appreciation for that team utility helps to buff what I think players don't understand is if you're providing a buff to your team, not your individual capacity matters, but now you're increasing the odds the rest of your team can carry. And unfortunately, I think that piece of utility has to be appreciated when we go back to look at the numbers and we see that Storm is doing incredibly well. Was that team utility really appreciated as much as it was? And can we use that information in the future to determine should we be playing more Storm? And probably the answer is if you're in solo queue, yes. You should be using that utility because if Storm's baseline is good enough, because again, it doesn't matter whether her self kit is only, let's say, viable. She's still providing a team aura, which means that someone on your team could be using that to elevate their own gameplay. So no matter where Storm is at, she is ultimately a good, viable character, and that team utility only elevates where her standing is. Ultimately, in my mind, was the best thing you could have been doing all last season. There was no reason for you not to be playing Storm. Oh, Squirrel Girl. Squirrel Girl, Squirrel Girl. I like Squirrel Girl. I think she's awesome. I think problematically, though, the ultimate issue with Squirrel Girl is I think she is undertuned with the understanding that she is a much easier character to play. She is much more accessible for characters. And the thing is, Squirrel Girl does crazy damage. And I think even as the season was reaching the end, players were beginning to recognize that on certain maps, Squirrel Girl can do crazy damage. The problem with Squirrel Girl, though, is that her whole kit revolves around doing a lot of AoE splash damage consistently. And the reality is that isn't always what you're playing against. There are just some games where the enemy team has like 4 or 5 characters spread all over the map. You may have a team where there may be a Venom or a Thor diver with 2 other DPS diver, and they may even have a Jeff for good measure. Well, in that game, Squirrel Girl's getting next to no value. I don't think she's underpowered, but honestly falling between viable and underpowered. This is why I'm making this case. The ultimate issue with Squirrel Girl is that because of the way that her kit plays, she has the ability to have incredibly high highs when the enemy team is stacked. And unfortunately, because right now that is not consistently always the case, ultimately, when you are not getting that value train of always facing against stacked up comps where you get to do all this massive AoE damage, she's unfortunately going to fall off. And the more spread out and the more divers an enemy team has, the worse Squirrel Girl is. Now, again, I'm sure there's great videos somewhere of like Squirrel Girls 1v1ing Psylocke and Magix and other thing. But for the vast majority of players, because we have to recognize that, like, Squirrel Girl is going to get decently picked. She still has an 8% pick rate. Why? Because she's accessible. And I think that even bad players are going to pick Squirrel Girl. And in that world where she is a kind of a low barrier to entry character with a low win rate, she is currently underpowered to adapt to the multiple comps that can exist in this game. I think ultimately her damage is in a good spot. I think her kit doesn't give her enough flexibility to face everything that the game can throw at her. I think if the game was a little bit more of stacked up meatball comps, Squirrel Girl would be much higher. Oh, Punisher. Punisher is, in my mind, that perfect. If there was a category between viable and underpowered, that's where I would put Punisher. Because Punisher goes right into that like problem of in some of the low tier games, he's not doing a whole lot. But as you kind of get higher and higher and you start to reach higher and higher categories, that win rate does begin to pick up just a little bit. And we do see that as you get higher up, he's just at that 48% mark in the highest levels of play. So what's going on? Well, the problem is that I think ultimately that Punisher is a very basic kit, which again is good because it's accessible to a lot of players, but ultimately what he's doing is not good enough standalone. Now, that could be just because his primary weapons don't have high enough base damage. His utility maybe isn't good enough in this type of game. There's a lot of things that can be talked about. But I think ultimately he is, Wyatt has a decently good pick rate and is just not quite at that 50 benchmark. And we have to also consider Punisher has one of the best team ups in the game with Rocket Raccoon. Now, I know, again, we're going to have a whole conversation on Rocket Raccoon, but anyone who has played with infinite ammo understands how crazy that team up is power-wise. So even with having one of the best team ups in the game, he was, arguably paired up with a healer that does not have a great community perception. How often Punisher was actually picked to maybe put into question. But when he is paired up with Rocket, his win rate does go up drastically. So this just ultimately means without the Rocket, Punisher's base kit is not doing the job enough. And so that's just begging the question of what is it that he needs? I'm not here to answer that. I'm just here to make the analysis that across all tiers, across all levels of play, he's good, he's just not there. He needs a little buff to really get him into more of this viable territory. As he stands right now, more often than not, you're probably losing with Punisher, even though there are opportunities where Punisher can do cool things. You're just not consistently seeing that. Wait, I'm sorry, but I'm hyped to see Human Torch and Viable. What was your reasoning there? So the argument for Human Torch, as a recap, and again, this kind of goes back to how we view numbers, is if I look at Human Torch, I was actually surprised that I put him because if you look at it bronze, garbage. We start climbing up. We start going to silver. Boys win rate picks up a little bit. Okay, cool, cool. Picks up again, 50%. We start getting into diamond territory, 51%. We get to diamond plus, grandmaster, celestial. We start to see this crazy high win rate at the highest levels of play for Human Torch. The problem with Human Torch is that his pick rate is super low. This means that the only people who are playing Human Torch right now, most likely, are people who probably exclusively play Human Torch. Or maybe there's an argument for like team up stuff, but realistically, Human Torch at the highest levels of play is seeing win rates, but in very rare games. This ultimately leads me to believe that Human Torch likely has the potential and has a crazy high top end, but that crazy to high top end is not accessible to the average player. Because even in gold, where I think the skill level begins to matter, you're barely crushing 50%. So I think the reality with Human Torch is that his kit has not been figured out by the greater community. The greater community does not understand what makes Human Torch work. So until that gets across what you're actually supposed to be doing, I think that right now Human Torch is viable because we clearly has the potential to be, winning these games and winning consistently above 50%, but just doesn't his kit isn't intuitive enough for the average player to understand that. So, because there is such a high win delta between the lowest levels and the highest level, I think he is probably realistically somewhere in the middle where he is probably actually on the more viable end. But until the knowledge of the character, because remember, he is the most recently introduced character with the Thing. But in the defense of the Thing was a much easier character to understand. He has a much lower skill ceiling. I think Human Torch's skill ceiling is much higher, and that's preventing the appropriate win rate across the board. So, as it stands, I think he was a viable character. I think just ultimately the problem was that people don't know how to play him correctly, and that at the end of the day, the more time is spent on Human Torch, the more that information is going to get released to the public. People are going to figure out the difference. That's going to make Human Torch a better character. So I think that Human Torch was a viable pick. Just the issue was the information wasn't there. I don't think you were wrong for picking Human Torch. I think you were wrong for picking Human Torch if you didn't put enough hours into it. Now we get to Bucky. Bucky. And Bucky's weird because I think Bucky easily, in the community perception, is that Bucky is broken. And I'm on this bandwagon of Bucky is broken. Bucky's ridiculously broken. But the numbers don't quite 100% reflect that. If we look, even at the highest level of play, Bucky isn't quite breaking that 50% benchmark. So what gives? What's going on? Well, I think there's a few things that we have to say. And I'm going to kind of put Bucky at the low end of strong, and I'm going to explain why. The biggest thing with Bucky is that he has a crazy high pick rate. Second highest in bronze, highest in silver, highest in gold, highest in plat, diamond plus, grandmaster plus, celestial plus. And notice how at the highest level of play, he's just sub 50, like barely sub 50 at the highest level of play. So what does that mean? I think what is ultimately happening is the win rate says one thing, that he isn't quite there. But I think the reality is it's not that Bucky himself isn't good, it's that the vast majority of players are picking Bucky without necessarily having the hours and the skill level of Bucky. It's not just Winter Soldier mains playing Bucky, but just everyone who plays DPS playing Bucky. And because of that extreme pick rate, you're seeing a massive. There's probably a very high delta between the actual Bucky mains and people who just said, "Oh, I'm gonna pick Bucky this game because Bucky's OP and we need to pick Bucky," and just throwing the game because they don't quite understand what makes Bucky OP or not having the necessary hours to play at that skill level. So, is he garbage? Is he bad? No, I don't think so at all. I think he's incredibly good, incredibly strong. But unfortunately, one of the problems with this website, kind of having to use the limited data that we have to make informed decisions, is we don't have all the data. We just have the pick rates, the win rates, the ban rates as our foundation. And I think that using that data, we have to kind of make certain guesses and assumptions. We also know that, again, Bucky had one of the strongest win rates of the game with Rocket Raccoon. Rocket Raccoon's infinite ammo team up was one of the better ones in the game. And we can actually, I'll even go ahead and show this. Where is it? Tier list and team ups. Both Winter Soldier and Punisher had 55% win rates when paired up with Rocket Raccoon. So likely Rocket was, again, we'll get to Rocket as an independent conversation, but the reality is that there is going to be some win rate delta skewing with having a really strong team up that is going to affect his win rate. Then we also talk about the individual power level, but also just recognize that so many people were probably playing Winter Soldier because of the community perception. And so you're going to get a lot of bad players or players who weren't quite. You're right, Pan Rocket. We're going to get to that too in a second. So I think that ultimately at the end of the day, this is ultimately what is worth mentioning. Now, again, as I mentioned, I did not talk a lot about team ups throughout most of this, and I'm going to kind of explain kind of why. If you notice, a lot of the team ups are in this A category, and they all kind of give about an average. Now, again, Human Torch has a bit more of a higher one, Mr. Fantastic has a bit more of a higher one, but most of them are about A tier. The biggest ones that really got some egregious ones, we've already kind of talked about. Star-Lord having one of the best team ups in the game. We're going to talk a lot more about that when we get to Adam Warlock. We didn't really talk about the Spider-Man team up. There's probably a conversation to be had about that. Again, probably need to take some time to reevaluate. Thor, again, having two really powerful team ups meant there was no reason for you not to be playing Thor. And considering especially Hela, Storm were two of the best DPS in the game, why are you not playing these characters, right? The Hulk team up, again, Hulk not getting a lot of play as we got into the season. One of the reasons we didn't talk about that team up. And we'll talk more about team ups as we get into the support category because several supports are going to be the reason why the team up conversation waits till the very end, and I'll explain why once we get there. And lastly, we have Wolverine. And anyone who plays at a high level knows how terrifying Wolverine can be. Wolverine is an absolute menace to higher tiers. But I'm going to put him in the higher end of viable. And I'm going to explain why. Wolverine's whole shtick was he abducts one player on the enemy team, steals him, flings him across the map, and you just get a free kill every time he successfully pulls that off. That's basically kind of the inverse of what every diver does, including Psylocke, Black Panther. The only difference is that instead of him going to their backline, he pulls someone on their team to your backline. It's just the same thing, but inverted. So he's incredibly scary. And the thing is he can grab someone like your Doctor Strange, like your Groot, your Magneto, and when it's your frontliner get pulled across the map, that disrupts your team's flow of the game. The problem is, I think the reality is that his consistency in that is not high enough. And I think that the experience of that is semi traumatizing, but not a real world consistency. It's a perceived danger because we recognize it's coming, but it's not so overpowered that it's just going to honestly auto guarantee you games. There are going to be Wolverine mains who are just absolute monsters with it and are consistent threats in your lobby. The reality is that the vast majority of players cannot replicate that consistently. And I think that outside of that, Wolverine can sometimes be a little underwhelming in what he does outside of his kidnap. So I think that while he's a strong character, I think statistically he is not as good as people imagine him. All right, now we get some kind of more my bread and butter. The healers. And now we're really going to start talking about team ups because I think this kind of highlights a lot of these healers team ups. I think are much more significant. And again, quite a few DPS have very crucial team ups that also I think kind of help justify why some of these characters we didn't really need to talk about before. First one, Adam Warlock, strong. And this is probably weird because in the beginning of this season, I think a lot of people just wrote off Adam Warlock as kind of bad. Or he was okay, but he was only really good in triple heal comps because his ult in itself isn't that great. And I know, and if you've ever played solo queue, you have been a victim of the terrible Adam Warlock ult that you died, you got rezzed, and then you died again to some stupid other ults on the enemy team. That happens to all of us. And it's an unfortunate consequence of kind of how Adam Warlock works. Now, with that being said, why then is Adam Warlock so good? Well, first off, we look at the win rate and we recognize that unlike the tanks, the win delta of healers is a little bit more egregious. So something weird is going on. One, healers are going to get picked way more often than tanks. We've already talked about triple healing being a consistent kind of meta comp idea that you can run, and people are comfortable with the idea of running triple heals. So triple healing has to be a part of the conversation as well. Where Adam Warlock, I think, was good, and I think what eventually makes him such an interesting choice is that Adam Warlock does a ton of damage in games. And I think this is why we see Adam Warlock having success in games. The damage output that Adam Warlock has allows him to get those crucial kills, both in dual target, dual heal and triple healing comps. And as we see in all levels of play, Adam Warlock is pretty consistently an above 50% win rate. Now, we do have to recognize that he has a lower pick rate and is on the bottom end of pick rate of all healers. But he still pops up in 1 out of 10 games, meaning that he has a high enough density of players consistently playing him. Ultimately, this is also a conversation we had that, again, without more data, we can't really know everything. Like, how often was Adam Warlock played in a 2-healer comp versus a 3-healer comp? We have to kind of assume that. Then also recognizing, in the case of Adam Warlock, there's one other thing we need to talk about. His team up is the strongest team up in the game, with him giving extra reses to Mantis and to Star-Lord. And with Star-Lord being a powerful DPS character, him getting a free res that's 100% HP res is insane. Like, this is a crazy powerful ability that I think people don't quite value. And I think only now in the very end of season 1 are people beginning to recognize that resing is a powerful tool. We have put a lot of value on healer ults, but reses can basically win games by themselves. And I think we're starting to see that as we progress more later and later into the season, if not just in solo queue, definitely in pro play. And I think that ultimately, this is that Adam Warlock was someone that I think was a sleeper pick all season. Not a lot of people were playing him as much, but I think his kit was strong enough, and the what he fulfills is really important. I also want to talk about one last thing with Adam Warlock, which is when we talked about Mr. Fantastic, we talked about the identity of roles being somewhat confusing. And what I mean by that is that we bucket everything as tank DPS healer or Vanguard duelist strategist. And the reality is that some characters do not cleanly fit into those buckets. Mr. Fantastic is a great example. His name or his category is duelist. But most people identify that Mr. Fantastic is not a duelist. He's just a tank that starts off with less HP. That's all he is. And so ultimately, this creates a problem in some of these analysis of what the strength of these characters are, because some of these characters work outside of the basic confines of 2-2-2 comp. Adam Warlock is a great example of this. Adam Warlock, yes, he is a strategist, but he is a high damage strategist. And that high damage is ultimately why I think so many people slept on him. He's not going to carry you with high HPS. He's going to carry you by headshotting someone on the enemy team. That is an incredibly valuable ability. Having a healer that can have almost as much headshot potential as a Hela, like Adam Warlock in terms of offensive ability is discount Hela. It's amazing. But that isn't always appreciated. But it is an important factor to recognize that some of these strategies that we'll talk about don't fit cleanly into that healer role that we imagine strategists should fill. And I think is also why we see certain numbers that we do. So in this case, Adam Warlock's offensive potential is actually the reason he's doing so well. And I think it's a really interesting case to recognize that healing CDs were not the king this season. Reses and damage were the kings this season. And we'll see that as I continue through this tier list. Next, Cloak and Dagger. Now, Cloak and Dagger is a little weird. And I'm gonna have to say this is gonna feel a little mean. It's gonna feel a little mean. I'm gonna put them in the underpowered category, and I'm gonna explain why. So, Cloak and Dagger are in this underpowered category because of several reasons. Part of me is biased, but I'll kind of explain what I mean. Cloak and Dagger are a super high pick rate character. And that means that they are going to lose games because a lot of people are going to pick them. If you notice, in all tiers, Cloak and Dagger was the most picked healer in the game by a significant margin. Okay, so why are you punishing them? Well, I'm punishing them because of the following. When we look at characters, we need to understand, does the pick rate of a character, is that also affected by the fact that are they easy to play? And generally speaking, characters with lower skill floors are going to be picked. Characters that are not complex are going to be picked more often. And the reality is, Cloak and Dagger is in many ways a deceptively easy pick for a lot of people. This means that Cloak and Dagger are going to be picked more, both by good players and by bad players, because of the simplicity of their kit. Okay, you made the same argument for Magneto, but Magneto is strong. Why is they worse? Magneto was still close to sub 50, meaning that if you were an unskilled tank player, you still almost had a 50-50% chance of winning the game with having no knowledge of Magneto. If you pick Cloak and Dagger, you have a 47% chance to win the game with no, on a character who is arguably as simple as Magneto and with arguably about a similar skill floor. This means that the base kit of Cloak and Dagger is not strong enough. I think ultimately, while she can do great things, and I know Cloak and Dagger has been all over the map. Now, she did receive a significant buff recently, which is why I'm going to change it to viable. But the problem is that this is a reflection, that viable ranking is an end of season perception, not a total season perception. I think if you were looking at the greater season as a whole, Cloak and Dagger was very much underpowered. I think that we gave her that the simplicity of her kit is too much and that her high end is overstated and that she is way too easy to counter. Next off, we have, and then I also want to point this out with Cloak and Dagger as well, because this is worth mentioning. This is ranked lowest win rate, and as you notice, doesn't matter which tier of play you're in, Cloak and Dagger is always a 47%er. She doesn't get better. She gets, in fact, worse as you climb up. She is absolutely an overrated healer, and I think that from a fair perspective, she should be labeled as underpowered. Now, again, she got a powerful buff near the end of the season. That would be the only reason to put her in viable, because I do think those buffs were significant enough, but unfortunately, we don't have data to support that. That's more of a feels choice. But I think, in retrospect, if I'm going to be talking about this tier list from the perspective of what you should have been playing all season, as a retrospective tier list, this is a much better fit. Invisible Woman. Invisible Woman was actually, I think, surprised me in the fact that when she was released, she looked a little weak. Not like terribly, terribly weak, but she did look a little underpowered. But I think that my general point of view on Invisible Woman is that she is incredibly good. I think ultimately she would be an argument from a raw numerical standpoint, probably just viable, but I think she's strong in the fact that, again, she has a crazy high pick rate. Most people who do not play healers are going to pick Cloak and Dagger or Invisible Woman because they are accessible, because they are easy to play, and because they have a strong kit. And I think Invisible Woman, out of all the defensive ult healers, Invisible Woman, Cloak and Dagger, Luna Snow, Mantis, and I guess arguably Loki, and we'll get to Loki in a bit, was the strongest defensive ult healer. I think anyone who makes the case that Invisible Woman is not the strongest defensive ult healer is smoking something. Or their argument for why she's not the strongest ult healer is dependent on another factor, which we'll get to when we get to Luna Snow, and I'm going to have a whole rant about it. She has an incredibly powerful defensive ult. She's really strong both offensively and defensively, and the utility that she brings is very good. And again, I think one of the things that makes Invisible Woman such an awesome healer compared to someone like Cloak and Dagger, for example, is that she can heal and deal damage simultaneously. Offensive capabilities on a healer is amazing. And it's just a shame that, unfortunately, we value the healers for their healing output, not for the kill potential that they bring to the table. And I think that's where Invisible Woman shines more compared to other healers, is her ability that a good Invisible Woman is someone who can heal and still find those opportunities to secure those kills for your team. Jeff. Oh, Jeff. So Jeff fits into the same problem, or has the Adam Warlock problem. Right now, due to the constraints of the game, we view things as, again, tank DPS healer. And I think the reality is Jeff doesn't fit that mold. Jeff is not a healer. Jeff is a DPS with a healing kit. And I think that until the community perception of Jeff changes, Jeff is always going to have this problem. When you're playing Jeff, the most optimal way to play Jeff currently is not to sit there backline heal your team. It's to find those flank angles, get a ton of pressure out, and find kill. And I think that the reality is that because we don't view Jeff in that way, this is ultimately bringing down his win rate. And I think that because even in that capacity, he's not quite strong enough, Jeff ultimately just is a little too weak, is a little too underpowered. And I think that it's ultimately going to take a change in ideology to change his win rate, right? Because right now, he is a low pick rate character with a low win rate. And at 43% win rate, there is an argument to be made of like, well, why should you ever pick Jeff? But we also have to recognize that, again, that part of Jeff's problem may be an identity crisis and community perception. People are picking Jeff because they think he's a healer. That's, I don't think, is correct. Now, when things change, if Jeff, if people start to perceive DPS Jeff as being a more viable pick, and then his win rate starts to alter, maybe that will help. But I think as of right now, Jeff is underpowered for what he's trying to do. His healing is way too low. His win rate reflects that. Right now, Jeff is lost. Loki. Loki is strong. I think a lot of people would make the argument when reflecting on the season that Loki was easily one of the best, if not the best healer in the game. And that would be a very fair assessment if we were playing on feelings. But I don't play on feelings. No. Ultimately, the thing with Loki is a super high skill rate, low pick rate healer. His flexibility allows him to excel. And what we're seeing in his win rate is that the lower pick rate tends to lean towards more people picking Loki, and really the Loki just being picked by more of the mains, not by casual players, which is fine. Nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with people just being Loki mains, and that's it. But I also think that ultimately what that means is we're going to see some inflated win rates due to the fact that it's just, oh, well, Loki is the super overpowered character. Well, it kind of was. But so let's now recognize why. The biggest thing that makes Loki so great, and I think this again goes back to recognizing this year in review, is ultimately what ends up paying off a lot is raw damage output. The damage output of certain healers made them king. Loki is a great example of a healer with crazy high damage output. Now, I'm sure there are videos out there where there's like a Loki main that's like, oh, look how like I out-healed all the other healers in the game. The reality is most Loki games, I'm sure, and again, I wish we had more data to support this, but generally speaking, Lokis are not winning by raw HPS output. They're not winning by having the highest healing numbers. What they are winning by is by having the damage and the pressure to put out so much damage that ultimately your team is able to secure kills while putting just enough healing to keep your team alive, especially your frontliners. So ultimately, the other major part of this is that Loki's flexibility, allowing him to get both defensive and offensive ults, is a massive, powerful ability. And so what we ended up seeing this season is Loki would be paired with some other defensive ult healer, like Invisible Woman, which is a really strong combo. Luna Snow, Cloak and Dagger. And so now you've got an incredibly offensive healer with a really interesting kit to deny dives with his like invul circle, basically. Also, then being able to put out super strong healing defensive ults. And this flexibility, meaning that if he's behind, you can put out a defensive ult. If you're ahead, you could steal a DPS ult and just murder the enemy team. Which again goes back to the higher skill ceiling of Loki, I think, is not easily accessible to most players. I think if you wanted to make the argument that he is one of the better characters, you could. I think if you were just looking at raw, like, high end, Loki probably has one of the highest high ends of any healer in the game. But I do not believe that, pragmatically speaking, that Loki is that accessible. And I also don't think that, as it stands right now, while he does have flexibility in both double healer and triple healer comps, that he is really the best thing that anyone could have been playing at that time. Again, his high end is incredibly high, but it also takes a lot of skill. So I think that most people, and part of the reason Loki wasn't played a whole lot by other players, is you need time and energy to learn the character. It's one of the reasons I said Human Torch was viable. He has a crazy high end, but you need to understand it. And I think Loki is kind of, I think doesn't need, I think more people have figured out Loki and we know how to play Loki. But I still think that skill ceiling is too high for, it is not accessible enough to make him the best thing. All right. If this video ever makes it to YouTube, this is what's going to get me flamed. I'll put Luna Snow in underpowered. And I already know I can hear somebody somewhere being like, you're doing this for clickbaits. And honestly, kind of am. But no, the real reality is I believe Luna Snow is incredibly overvalued as a support, and I'm going to kind of go over it and discuss why that is, why I think she's overvalued, and kind of what the perspective is. So ultimately, when we look at Luna Snow, I think a lot of people looked at Luna Snow and they immediately put her best thing you could be playing. And the reason we put her as the best thing you can be playing is because I think even I cannot deny that she has one of the most absurd defensive ults in the game by a mile. It's crazy good. But if her ult is really that good, we have to ask ourselves, why then is there not a single tier of play where she cracks 50% win rate if she's that strong? Also, we have to recognize as well, in addition to this, that no matter what tier of play you're looking at, Luna Snow is consistently a fairly high-picked character. Now, so about 1 in 3 games, you're going to get a Luna Snow. And it only gets higher the higher you go up. So a character that's picked 1 in 3 games, but barely breaks 48% win rate only at the very highest level of play. And we say that this is the best thing you can be playing. Well, that doesn't make any sense. So I guess she breaks almost 49 in silver. And then we check the rest, 47, 47, 47, 47. Okay, so what's happening? Why is this happening? What's going on? The reality is, despite having one of the strongest ults in the game, there are certain things that I think are not well appreciated at this time. One of the biggest community misperceptions, and I think this is really interesting, is we treat the healer defensive ults like mini invulnerabilities. This is why we value Luna Snow at such a high rate, because we sit there and we go, oh, well, she's got this like 12-second invul window. How is that not the most overpowered thing you keep playing? And if you only saw it in that light, as if you said you have a character that gives you a 12-second invulnerability window, heck yeah! You would think this was the best thing to be doing. Why wouldn't you play that? But the reality is that's a false perception. Now, some would say, well, we know that you can actually kill Luna Snow in a roll. It just doesn't happen a whole lot. The problem is, I think that over the course of season one of the reasons Magneto became such a higher pick tank was because more and more people began to figure out how to kill Cloak and Dagger and how to kill Luna Snow in their respective ults. Meaning that you were playing a healer who ultimately could not use their ult as frequently as they want. Or if they did use their ult got negated by a counter enemy ult. That is problematic. It doesn't matter how strong your ult can be, it's a matter of what is your ult actually achieving in your games. And I think ultimately this is where Luna Snow slowly begins to fall flat and is one of the biggest reasons Cloak and Dagger performed so poorly throughout this season. Because you could just kill them in their ult. They could pop their ult and then they would just die as soon as their ult animation finished. And then they didn't have an ult. Well, what good is that? That doesn't do nobody any good. You're down a healer to do nothing. Luna Snow is kind of a similar story. The other major issue with Luna Snow is, congrats, you have a 12-second invul window, but what is she doing? She's playing DDR. She's playing Dance Dance Revolution, not contributing other than providing this ring of supposed invulnerability that people can still die in from other enemy ults. So when we look at that, that means that ultimately what we now have to recognize is her base kit that good? And this is, I think, the other problem with Cloak and Dagger. Their base kits are really not that great. At least in the argument of Cloak and Dagger is it's a low skill floor character, but the base numbers on it was so low that it just wasn't effective enough if you didn't have any real experience on the character and you weren't going to get a whole lot of value over the course of a game. Luna Snow is almost arguably worse, and the fact that you need a slightly higher, you actually have to be able to aim. Cloak and Dagger, you just fire off the wall and you'll still hit somebody with healing. Luna, you do actually have to have some aiming. Now, granted, if you can aim, you can do a lot more. You can heal your team. You can heal your team and snipe the enemy DPS at the same time. Sure, great. But you have no mobility. You have no mobility. You have one skill shot CC. And if you're unable to aim or hit your skill shot CC, pragmatically speaking, you are a borderline garbage healer. And I think this ultimately is the ultimate bait. It is a pick that it is a weak character attached to the strongest ult in the game. And that ult is so shiny that we value it super, super hard without recognizing that if you don't have a strong base kit, your ult doesn't matter. And if your ult can just get countered anyways, why are we putting all our eggs in your basket? And this ultimately is a real kind of sort of problematic issue as well. It's just ultimately, is it really as good as we imagine her to be? And I think the answer is no. I think we bloat the value of Luna Snow and say that she's superpowered. Now, there is going to be an argument, I know this is coming up somewhere, if anyone actually ever argues this, that says, well, hold on a minute. If Luna Snow's played that often, well, how many Luna Snow versus Luna Snow games are there that's going to subsequently bring down her win rate because in those games you have one win, one loss Luna Snow? And my answer to that is that the argument is almost kind of irrelevant still. Because A, she's still only the third or fourth most picked healer, depending on what tier of play you're in. And then even if you wanted to make that argument, well, your ultimate issue then is, okay, but what about the subset of games outside of those games? Well, that means that in all those games, the subset of all those games outside of the mirror matches, she's still net losing. which is the only way she can have a 48% win rate. So even if you wanted to argue that there's this huge block of games that are mirror matches, well, there's still a subset of games where she's losing so drastically. Like, it's actually even worse. She would have to have so many losses in the games where she doesn't have a mirror match to go from 50% to 47%. So then that actually means she's worse than the average healer in the game for that number to exist. So ultimately, at the end of the day, she is a super heavy, overvalued support. And the reality is, I think that the community perception of her is overinflated. I know, again, I know some people think I'm just saying that for clickbait, but that's not the reality. The numbers back it up. I think we just give this character too much credit and we put too much faith in this ult that just realistically is not that good. All right. The last two, Rocket Raccoon and Mantis. So I mentioned I'm a Rocket Raccoon main. So I mentioned at the start of this video that I have a bias, and I'm going to I'm still committing to that. I am biased, which is why I'm putting Mantis as the best thing you could have been playing this season. So let's kind of back up for a second. If we go back to kind of the statistics and whatnot, and we look at what was happening throughout the season, one of the things we will recognize is Mantis had a higher win rate, but Rocket Raccoon was played way more. So this kind of leads to a few things that we have to talk about and kind of understand what's happening. So Rocket was picked, and I guess I'll go ahead and just kind of spoil it. Rocket, I think, was one of the strongest supports you could have been playing all season, but not the best support. So first off, why Mantis was actually the best? Why was Mantis realistically the best healer you could have been playing? So we look at it, we look at the win rates, right? And we go across the tier list. And as we can see, she's consistently this high win rate character, no matter what tier play you're in. And it's not even like small margins. It's 2 to almost 5% win rate bonus for playing Mantis. And again, someone might be asking, okay, cool, but doesn't she have a lower pick rate? She do. So there is a bit of an argument to be said that, okay, well, high skill players are probably picking her more. Okay, let's humor that argument for a little bit. Because, again, you can recognize, again, no matter what tier play you go, she might be one of the lowest pick rate healers in the game. So is that a fair assessment? Well, even when we get to Grandmaster Plus, she is still picked roughly one in every 10 games. She's picked 11% of the time. So 1 in every 10 games, she's being picked. Likely speaking, because there is such an inflated number of strategists, you're still going to have games where you have a mixture of both Mantis mains and non-Mantis mains. Now, the data would suggest likely that it is skewed towards Mantis mains. But even if that is the case, and it's skewed towards Mantis mains, I want to point out something really interesting by comparison that may not seem initially as obvious. When we go to DPS, Storm was the highest win rate across all tiers at 53%. But the next couple highest are 51, 52, 52, and then every other DPS in all tier is sub 50% win rate. That's interesting, meaning that on average across all tiers, DPS players were losing more games, kind of respectively. Now again, there's some, we gotta talk, like there's some complexity to that statement. But genuinely speaking, you had a much lower win rate. When we start getting to the healers, though, the win delta starts to become more egregious. And we see that, again, we start to see a little bit more of a balance of, hey, champions that are, some of the characters that are not played as often are winning exceptionally more games. But this now leads to kind of where I think we take the data, we extrapolate the data, and then we try to come up to a conclusion to what actually is good in this game. And the reality is, Mantis does everything. And it's like super undervalued the utility that this character brings, and the fact that she is still played by both high end and less skilled players. Even if we wanted to make the argument that the less skilled players were bringing her win rate down, the win rate from higher skilled players must have been dramatically higher. Enough that she's out again across the board, consistently winning more games than even some of the best DPS players or even some of the best tank players, respectively. This is super fascinating. So, what makes Mantis good? Well, the first thing, as I mentioned, one of the things that I think really stood out in terms of win rate for this season and what made certain healers super strong is damage output. If you look at three of the best healers in the game, Loki, Adam Warlock, Invisible Woman, these are all high damage healers. They are incredibly strong. They are incredibly good at putting out damage and have utility to match it. Now, you might be going, well, Jeff puts out a lot of damage. Why is he not good? Part of why Jeff is not good comparatively also has to do with the second part. Do you have a good ult to pair with? And the reality is, Jeff's low healing output combined with a poor ult that doesn't always get the value that it needs prevents Jeff from excelling. And while he can get kills, unfortunately, it realistically puts your team at half a healer. In the case of Loki, Loki can put out as much damage as Jeff, but also has some incredibly powerful healing utility, both in his base kit and can copy another healer ult, giving you that flexibility of option of, do you need defensive ability or offensive ability? That's super amazing. Even Adam Warlock's healing, while it's not as maybe as consistent as other healers, it's still a bomb heal. It heals for a ton. And so when you are playing Adam Warlock a little bit more defensively, you can put out a crazy amount of healing. And then in triple healing, it doesn't matter that you don't put as much healing because your cooldowns are more accessible because you have two other healers with you. In the case of Mantis, Mantis's healing isn't as high, kind of like Adam Warlock and Loki, but her own damage output is super high, both because of her own self-steroid and, more importantly, when I talked about Storm earlier, I mentioned that Storm was valuable because she gave buffs to other people. And the same is true for Mantis. Mantis allows you to identify the strongest person on your team and give them an incredibly powerful steroid. That difference of being able to give your teammates an incredibly powerful offensive steroid allows you to identify the best player in the team, allow them to snowball the game harder, ultimately winning the game. This also leads to one other crucial point. One of the things that is overstated, and I think the healers best demonstrate this, is that we overvalue ultimates. And the reality is, a lot of the game in Marvel Rivals is won in between ultimates. What does that mean? Does that mean that you can't have a game-winning ultimate that changes the whole pace of the game? Absolutely you can. Does that mean that you can't, that like your ultimate didn't stop something dangerous or chaotic from happening? Absolutely you can make those arguments. Ultimates are meant to be game-changing. The problem is you have 11 other people in the game with game-changing ultimates. So, okay, so we have 12 game-changing ultimates in the game, so what? Well, the reality is that we view ultimately we view the game as a system in where where basically we first value damage when we are new to the game and don't understand the game. And then eventually we get exceptional enough to recognize that this game is a game of cooldowns, that you should be treating your cooldowns. So, for example, if Star Lord pops ult, Invisible Woman should be popping her ult as a response, and so the game becomes a game of cooldowns. And that's the next stage of skill expression. Ultimately, though, and I think this is what Season 1 kind of demonstrates, and we'll see if this carries on to Season 2. Ultimately, if you truly want to win at Marvel Rivals, the meme of, or you have the dumb person, the guy who thinks he's smart, and the guy who actually, like, is smart, but it's kind of just gone full circle, it eventually all comes back to damage again. First, when you're new to the game, you think damage and kills is everything. Then when you start getting good at the game, you start thinking cooldowns are everything. And we start to believe that some of these cooldown ults are like broken, such as Luna Snow. But then ultimately, at the end, what ultimately wins games is damage and kills again. But more importantly, what damage and kills are you getting outside of your ultimate? And Mantis being able to provide a massive damage steroid at any point in time allows characters to get those crucial kills in between ult cooldowns, which ultimately changes the pacing of the game. That is why she is one of the best. She has high damage. Her healing, being whatever, is still healing. She's still going to get some healing out throughout the game. But she's not winning you the game because she's putting out double everyone else's healing. She's winning you the game because she just got a headshot on the enemy DPS, buffed your other DPS, who got 3 more kills outside of their ult, and won you a major team fight without any ults being popped. That's what's winning you games. Your Luna Snow popping ult did not win you the game. Mantis buffing your Star Lord so that he can get the crucial kill behind the enemy team before any ults can be popped, that won you the game. That is ultimately what it. And then let's actually get to the actual ult part. One of the cool things about Mantis is not only she's a high damage healer, like Loki, like Adam Warlock, not only does she have okay healing for a healer, I mean, again, she probably does about as much as Loki, realistically, if you're just looking at raw healing numbers. But then her ultimate is what you really need. Your ult doesn't need to last 10,000 years to be good. Mantis's ult is best used when you ult to counter an enemy ult and use that window to find an opportunity to kill. Her ult is Luna Snow ult, but better. Because she can pop her ult to negate an important ult on the enemy team and then go run down the enemy healer and snipe them out of existence. This is a crazy advantage, ultimately. The ability to have agency within your ult is an incredibly undervalued and underappreciated mechanic. It's also why Invisible Woman is incredibly strong in her ult, because she pops her ult and she can still output damage. She's not limited in what she can do. So she's finding offensive opportunities within her ult as well. This is something that's super undervalued with both of these healers. It's what makes these healers so good. It's why these healers are consistently winning games. Now we get to Rocket Raccoon. And in some ways, he's ironically the antithesis, but also kind of an elaboration on the same points that I think ultimately were underappreciated in this season. So Rocket Raccoon, I think, as a lot of people know, gets a lot of hate. And he was pretty much been hated on the entire season. And I know this because Lord knows I've got video clips of somebody ranting at me for playing Rocket Raccoon for whatever reason, right? And it's not, and I'm talking like before the game even starts. But okay, so what? If Rocket Raccoon was so bad, why is it that in virtually every tier of play, he's consistently one of the highest win rate supports in the game by a significant margin, coupled with almost a pick rate of like 1 in 4. Rocket Raccoon had a high presence and a high win rate all season. while also simultaneously being, I think, in a larger community perception, one of the least liked and probably most hated healer in the game. Well, I think what that ultimately comes down to is community perception and the fallacies that we walked into the season with. And again, this is partially why I'm making this video, to talk about some of these fallacies. We valued the ultimates of certain characters and defined that the ultimates of these characters is what is going to win you games. And the truth is, without a good base kit, your ultimate is useless. And I think this season, in my mind, emphasized that point immensely. If you don't have a good base kit, if you cannot create the opportunity to win the game outside of your ult, your character is not good right now. It is not strong enough right now. This is why, if you notice, as you go slower and lower down the list, much of the characters that are high up on the list are able to make massive impacts outside of their ult. And the lower you go, the less and less impact in the game that character has outside of their ult. And again, you can make some arguments that, like, oh, well, Namor feels like good outside of his ult, or like Punisher's ult is the craziest because he always gets gunned down, which again kind of feeds back to the point that, like, if you're just getting gunned down in your ult, is your ult good? Right? So on and so forth. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if you're only looking at the game from an ult lens, you're gonna miss what one of the, like, why characters are so good. Rocket Raccoon is known for being a heal bot and being a notorious heal bot. And this is the other extreme end of the spectrum for strategists. One of the things that made strategists really good this season is those that could put out damage won games because they could find the opportunities to get picks. Now, Rocket can do the same. And again, you will see gameplay footage of, Grandmaster Celestial Rockets who are looking out for kills and aggressively seeking kills. But realistically, a lot of Rockets win games by doing like less than 1,000 damage the entire game. Well, what does that tell you? Why is that? Why is Healbot Rocket so effective? Because it's doing the exact win condition in reverse. Instead of you winning via seeking those opportune kills like Adam Warlock, the Mantis, the Loki, you're denying any possibility of your opponents getting kills by massively heal body. And someone may go, well, doesn't Cloak and Dagger do the same thing? Well, no. There's a massive difference. You look at the heal numbers between a Rocket Raccoon and a Cloak and Dagger or a Luna Snow or even an Invisible Woman. And one of the things you may recognize is their heal numbers, depending on the game, and again, it changes game to game, are all semi-relative. They're not like Rocket can have games where he's way more than all the other healers. But you can have a game where a Cloak and Dagger does more than a Rocket, or an Invisible Woman does more than a Rocket. Does that mean the Rocket wasn't healing? No. But Rocket doesn't have a healing ult. And this is ultimately my major point. Rocket is putting as much healing numbers, and in quite a few games, more healing than these other healers without having access to some of the most powerful healing utility in the game. Think about that. Luna Snow has the strongest healing ult in the game and will still do less healing than a Rocket. What does that tell you? Well, that tells you that the effective healing Rocket is putting out throughout the course of an entire match is much more effective than Luna Snow's healing. That he is actually, in his base kit, putting out an aggressively larger amount of healing per second than most other healers outside of ultimates. This then leads to the second reason Rocket Raccoon is considered so good in my mind. First off, as I mentioned with Adam Warlock, Reses ended up being a major win con for quite a few games throughout the course of the year. And I think as time progressed, people began to recognize the value of reses the later the season went on. And if you watch pro play, you may notice that several teams now are banning Adam Warlock and Rocket Raccoon. Why? Because reses prevent or basically they counteract the mistakes that your team made. So if you lose 3 people from a really bad ult and you get all 3 of them back, it's like that ult never happened. That's a massive swing in tempo in the course of a game. If someone gets unfortunately picked because the enemy Hela is cracked and Rocket rests them back, well, that negates any tempo advantage that they have for the next 30 to 40 seconds until the next pick happens. But again, picks are picks. They're not just a super frequent thing unless it's a clear skill difference, at which point there's nothing Rocket can do. But in games where the games are close, that one res ultimately prevents the enemy team from being able to capitalize on mistakes. And that is a massive concept that I think kind of just goes over a lot of people's heads. That games are not just won because of raw power. It's mistakes that happen. And that people are capitalizing on each other's mistakes. And that characters like Adam Warlock and Rocket Raccoon effectively negate those mistakes. They say that was a really bad play. Now I'm going to wipe the board clean, and now it never happened. And that ultimately is an incredibly awesome thing. And it sucks, but it's super important that we recognize that tempo swing, that ability to negate massive tempo swings with reses from Rocket Ult or Adam Warlock ult ended up being much better than we perceived at the beginning of this season. And then lastly, we get to the last thing I'm going to talk about. And again, I'm going to talk about this because I am a Rocket main. And the reason why I think this ultimately goes here is his ult. And I think this is also one of the things that we can learn from looking at the win rates and pick rates throughout the season and why things panned out the way that they did. Why did Rocket win so many games despite not having access to a defensive ult? Every other healer has access, with the exception of Jeff, which again, we notice Jeff is much lower, to a defensive ult, except for Rocket, who still outperformed all the real healers. What happened? Why did that happen? Well, I think this ultimately goes back to the conversation of we misvalued ultimates. We view defensive ultimates and we treat them like pseudo invuls, and that's not the case. And Rocket Ult is one of the greatest tools for negating an enemy ultimate. What does that mean? A lot of people, there's going to be all sorts of memes. I'm sure many of Rocket needs its own tier. A lot of people will have memes out there about how they get tired of hearing something like, it's showtime, or like they hear the Luna ult. I forget what the voice line for it is. And then your Rocket just pops Rocket Ult, and you're like, well, that doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good until you get to higher tiers of play, at which point, one of the worst combinations that you can experience in higher play is Rocket Ult with, let's say, a Punisher ult and an Invisible Woman ult. Well, now you have basically an invulnerable Punisher gunning down an entire team, and it doesn't matter if the enemy team pops a healer ult. If Luna Snow pops a healer ult, while Punisher is buffed up by Rocket Raccoon and protected by Invisible Woman, she's dead. That's a negated ult. And that is the true advantage of Rocket Raccoon, and something that I think a lot of players at higher levels began to recognize is when you pair Rocket Ult with other ultimates, the enemy is now put in this terrible situation where if they pop their defensive ult, they're just going to die and they're going to waste that defensive ult because Rocket Ult plus certain other ultimates can basically murder the healer within their ultimates. And that is a crazy powerful advantage to have in this game. The ability that if teams are overvaluing healer ults, you can just negate it by pressing a rocket ultimate and blowing up the healer. That is crazy. That is kind of that is where Rocket is heavily misunderstood as a healer. And so, ultimately, at the end of the day, this is ultimately the way that I see that this last season panned out. I think that this is about the best view that we can have of understanding what was good, what was not good, what was not. One of the takeaways I would say is I think divers to some extent are a mixed bag. Because divers to some extent, while being good, I think got worse at the highest tier play. But I think if you just look at the tier list on their own, they look incredibly strong. They are strong. And they were something very powerful you could play all season. This means as we move forward, we have to keep our eyes out on diver comps to really see, is this going to change the meta? If we end up nerfing healers too much, they may spiral out of control and become the next best thing. Other than that, this is what I would say is the biggest takeaways you take from this season. Again, hopefully I provided enough context. I think the only thing I didn't really mention were team ups again. So to kind of go back to that real quick, I'll give a quick summary, quick rundown of kind of what we can ultimately learn from team ups. Is team ups were an incredibly powerful tool. And there is an argument to be said that some of these characters could be somewhat worse or better depending on the strength of their team ups. And while that is true, ultimately speaking, if a team up is strong and your character is good, you're going to want to play that character more. Hence, if you notice that Hela was particularly strong all season, you're going to want to play Thor more. And likewise, if Thor is good, you're going to pick characters like Storm and Hela. So it's a self-feeding issue. Ultimately, most team-ups ended up being a net positive for most characters. Very few of them were arguably bad or non-existent, like, sadly, the Moon Knight Cloak and Dagger ultimate being borderline useless. But ultimately, and then, I think even if we take a look, no, Spider-Man and Squirrel Girl got a net positive. Thing and Wolverine, kind of whatever. Nothing crazy, right? But most of the team-ups ended up being good. And I think this ultimately just means that if you can get team-ups, you should use team-ups. And I think that if characters are going to be strong, you're going to see team-ups used more, which means, okay, well, your team-up is supposed to be a bonus. So if you're already playing a good character, your team-up's just going to buff your win rate higher. So, is there a case that maybe some of these characters were slightly weaker or slightly stronger than they actually were perceived because of team-ups? Maybe. But I don't think there's a strong enough case for any real character that the team-up made such an egregious difference on their overall team rate that should be factored in. Some of the exceptions I will say, Star-Lord is kind of in that list because he is just sub 50% win rate, but buffs to almost like 70% win rate with his combo. Again, the Penny buff. The question is, how often are you realistically playing Venom and Penny? I don't know. I don't believe that's a high thing. I think that's got to be semi-excluded. Thor and Hela, again, Hela, Storm, again, a lot of these were already strong characters to begin with. You could argue maybe some of that win rate is elevated by that team up, but I don't imagine it. Human Torch does have an incredibly strong win rate. That might be a case where we'd have to look at. Were a lot of his wins in higher tier only because of the Storm? In fact, if that's the case, is Storm just so broken that she can make one of the worst DPS that look that good? I don't know. That's a meaningful question. They do have a lot of AoE. Maybe something to look into. But overall, I think most of the characters' win rates are not worth really mentioning, talking about how their team-ups could have made a massive difference in the evaluation of those characters in the tier list. So this is what we learned from season 1. Season 1 was I had fun this season. Clearly, it was a learning experience for the community, for players, for the dev team, all sorts of good stuff. I will say, and this is my honest opinion of the game, if you notice the way that I organized, best, strong, viable, underpowered, dumpster fire, I would say the dev team has done a good job where most characters genuinely feel good to play. And I think even if you picked some of these underpowered characters, most underpowered characters you can genuinely play. And if you spend enough time on them, you probably can still get above a 50% win rate on most characters. And I think that that is a good place to be in your game. When we realistically look about what was strong and what was weak, one of the things I want to point out is even on weak characters, I'm talking like 47% win rate. That's 3% below 50. That's not terrible in the grand scheme of things. Talking about how a character's bad because they're just 3% under 50% win rate is not a bad place to be in the grand scheme of things. So honestly, most of the cast you can play and feel good about. I would say right now, as long as you're not realistically playing Black Widow, you're probably in a good spot in the game right now. Yeah, if you're playing something underpowered, you may want to consider playing something better. And maybe want to consider, hey, is there better things I could be doing with my time? And if you enjoy playing those characters, so be it. There's nothing wrong with that.